Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised.
That's a really hard sell. NFP and the church's teaching on sex and intimacy and marriage are a really, really hard sell. What I tote on this podcast is a hard sell. When you are trying to talk to someone about it, maybe it's your friend, maybe it's your husband, maybe it's parents, or maybe it's your children. When you're trying to talk to someone about NFP and the church's teaching and your convictions behind them and why we should follow these teachings, it is an incredibly hard sell. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the sex and intimacy podcast for Catholic women. My name is Ellen Holloway, and I am a Catholic speaker and coach who specializes in sex and marital intimacy. And I am on a mission to help you actually enjoy and desire good and holy sex with your spouse. Recently, I was traveling with my family, and I was speaking with a family member about what I do and the podcast. And I'll be honest, because of the subject matter, my extended family don't really know very much about what I do. I mean, even honestly, my parents don't really know that much about what I talk about, which is fine. If they asked, I would tell them, but it's just not a topic that I bring up when I'm visiting my parents. But I got into a conversation with a family member about what I do, and I actually really got into what it is that I talk about here on this podcast. I got into NFP, the church's teaching on contraception, on IVF. I got into conversations about, what is licit and illicit, what's moral in the bedroom. These things that I regularly talk about in the podcast. And this family member that I was speaking to, after I had kind of gotten on my soapbox and shared my whole spiel, just looked at me and said, "That's a really hard sell." And I wasn't quite expecting that reaction. I was actually more expecting kind of confrontation and arguing about how I was wrong or something like that. But he just said, "That's a really hard sell." And I looked right back at him and I said, "Yeah, it is." Because here's the thing. What the church is calling us to in marriage, the openness to life, regularly, recognizing, communicating, understanding, unifying with our spouse in a way that respects the design of the sexual act is a very, very hard sell. It's not supposed to be easy to sell. It's not supposed to be easy to do. Marriage is not supposed to be easy to do. Having sex in a morally appropriate way that gives glory to God isn't supposed to be easy. The Christian life isn't supposed to be easy. Suffering is a part of the Christian life. And a lot of times we get really uncomfortable when you start talking about suffering inside of like marriage and sex. And we're like, oh, we shouldn't suffer in marriage. But the thing is, like, Jesus suffered for us. His marriage to his bride, the church, was suffering. His marriage to his bride, the church, was his crucifixion on the cross. He suffered to marry his bride. And he suffers, in a way, right? The crucifixion, yes, is a historical event, but it is also, God is outside of time, right? So it is happening, continually happening, but it also has already happened. This is that already not yet aspect that we live in here in this, like, we have been redeemed by Christ, but we are not yet at the eschaton of heaven. Like, Christ didn't say it's going to be easy to follow me, right? We think of the rich young man who said, "Hey, I follow all the commandments. Like, Lord, what else? And he said, sell everything and come follow me. And the rich young man was like, ooh, I can't do that. That's too hard. But Jesus didn't say, oh, okay, that's all right. I know that's too hard. Why don't you sell half your things and then come follow me? No, he just said, he didn't say anything to the rich young man. He just was, sad for him, right?
We'll be back with the episode in just a minute.
Are you struggling with sexual pleasure or just really feeling connected with your husband during sex? I would argue that foreplay is probably the culprit here. Foreplay is wildly important, but not something that we're ever really taught how to do or what to do. And that is why I created a completely free 5-day foreplay foundations course for you. Head to vinesandfullbloom.com/foreplay or click the link in the show notes for the completely free 5-day foreplay foundations course. And, so Christ calls us to really hard things. And living out NFP, living out openness to life, following the church's teaching on all these aspects is so extremely hard. And because it's hard, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. I feel like I see this sentiment often that like, oh, God wouldn't want me to suffer in this way. God wouldn't want me, like, he wouldn't want our husband and I to be, disconnected for so long because we have to abstain because we're avoiding pregnancy. God, like this sentiment of God doesn't want me to suffer. And that's not really right. Sure, God doesn't want you to, suffer. There's truth in that. But God suffered. God recognizes that because of our fallen nature, suffering is necessary for our redemption. So sure, in a way, God doesn't want you to suffer, just like I don't want my kids to cry. But sometimes my kids cry when I tell them that they cannot have candy for breakfast. And I have to just allow that suffering of my children because it is for their good. It is for their good that I am not feeding my 3-year-old son candy for breakfast. That's where God is. God the Father who loves us. He recognizes that in order for our hearts to be changed, for our souls to be purified, that suffering is necessary. The bride will go the way of the bridegroom. Christ the bridegroom suffered and died on the cross. We, the bride, we, the church, will suffer and die in order to get to heaven. So really, I was just reflecting so much on this comment that was given to me of, wow, that's a really hard sell. And yes, it is. And I embrace the fact that it is a hard sell. I embrace the fact that the things that I talk about on this podcast are so hard to hear sometimes. And I try not to be harsh about it. I try to share these things with all the compassion that I can, but I'm not perfect. And I know that people who listen to this podcast get offended at things that I say, but that's okay. Because I'm not trying to water down anything. And it is hard. And that's okay. So keep at it. Keep fighting the fight. It isn't actually supposed to be easy. And I think sometimes when we can recognize that, we can feel a little bit more comfortable in the discomfort of suffering within our marriages. Whether it's we're suffering because of NFP or we're suffering because some aspect of church teaching is hard for us to understand, or we're suffering because our spouse doesn't want to follow church teaching. Wherever that suffering is happening, all of us are suffering in our marriages. But when we recognize that suffering is actually good, is actually necessary, it's necessary for our salvation, it's necessary to mold us and to purify our hearts, then we can come at that suffering in a different light, right? We can look at that suffering as a greater good, right? God is only going to allow that which he can create a greater good out of. And yeah, that's not going to make it suddenly easy. But I think what that does is it makes it possible for us to endure the suffering, because we know that it is not meaningless suffering. And we can trust in the fact that God is creating a greater good out of this suffering. We might not see that greater good in this life. We may only see that greater good in heaven. And that's an even harder pill to swallow, right? NFP might be hard for the rest of your life. Sex might be hard for the rest of your life. Ooh, that feels awful. That feels awful to think about. But I know that God only allows that suffering that will ultimately bring us to heaven. And this is what is meant by uniting yourself to the cross, right? Christ's suffering brought him to heaven. He couldn't have gotten there without the cross. He had to suffer and die. And there is such beauty in that, but it was still the most painful, horrific, terrible thing that could have happened to a human being. And it happened to our God. So keep it up, right? Keep up the fight. Keep striving to follow God's will. You are doing amazing. You're doing great. Keep at it. Keep having those conversations with your spouse who doesn't want to follow church teaching. Keep bringing these difficulties to God when you just can't. You're just frustrated with NFP, when you're frustrated with abstinence. Keep going to confession when you falter. God doesn't care how many times you go to confession. He cares that you come. So go again and go again, even if it's the same exact thing every time. Ask God for help in that. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.